The Red Sea does not forgive hesitation. On the morning of 3:47 a.m., with the horizon still a bruised line of indigo and the salt air carrying the faint metallic edge of a coming squall, the Combat Information Center aboard the USS Harrowing, Truman was already operating at the upper limit of sustained human attention. 11 days. That was how long the carrier strike group had been threading the contested corridor between the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and the Gulf of Aden, executing around-the-clock air operations while Houthi forces, armed, equipped, and guided by Iranian military advisors operating from positions inside Yemen, continued to refine their targeting doctrine with each failed attempt. The enemy was learning. That was the part that never made it into the briefings back home. The adversary was not static. They were watching, analyzing, adjusting, and every intercepted salvo taught them something new about the seams in the defensive net. The Truman herself displaced over 100,000 tons of steel and aviation fuel. Her flight deck stretched longer than 3 football fields. Her crew of nearly 5,000 operating in rotations that blurred the line between exhaustion and function. She was not just a warship. She was a floating air base, a mobile sovereign territory, the physical embodiment of American power projection in one of the world's most strategically vital choke points. If she went dark, everything in the region went dark with her. At 3:47 a.m., the electronic warfare officer in the CIC received the first anomalous signal. It was not dramatic. There was no alarm, no flashing light, just a tone, and a number on a screen that did not match any scheduled activity. The weapons control officer leaned in. The data was clean. It was not a ghost. Somewhere on the Yemeni coastline, a mobile launch platform, the kind that Iranian advisors had spent months positioning in concealed revetments, had just committed to a firing solution. The first ballistic missile was already at 50,000 feet, and climbing when the Spy-1D radar array painted it in full resolution. Seconds later, 2 more traces appeared, then a fourth. The strike package was not a harassment attempt. It was a deliberate, sequenced volley designed to overwhelm the defensive engagement envelope by forcing simultaneous intercept decisions. The tactical action officer did not hesitate. SM-3 Block 2. A interceptors launched from the vertical launch system cells on the destroyer screen in rapid succession, each missile riding a column of white fire into a sky still dark enough for the thermal bloom to be visible from the flight deck. The crew on watch felt the deck plates vibrate beneath their boots. They had felt it before. They knew what came next. The first 3 intercepts were clean. The tracking data confirmed it. Kinetic impact at altitude, debris field consistent with terminal phase neutralization, no fragments large enough to threaten the surface group. But the 4th missile had done something unexpected. Its terminal guidance had shifted. Not randomly, deliberately. Someone on the ground monitoring the engagement in real time through a data link that intelligence analysts had not yet fully mapped, had sent a correction command during the descent phase. The missile's trajectory adjusted by 11 degrees. It was a small correction, but it moved the impact point from open water to within 400 meters of the Truman's port side. The SM-2 battery on the escort destroyer engaged. The intercept was not clean. At an altitude of less than 300 meters, the warhead was struck. Not destroyed, but deflected. The fragmentation pattern was wide, high velocity, and entirely unpredictable. A cloud of supersonic debris raked the port quarter of the strike group's outer defensive ring. Most of it was inconsequential, metal fragments spinning harmlessly into dark water. But one piece, a dense tungsten-alloyed fragment from the missile's guidance module, struck the aft communications antenna array on the Truman's Island superstructure at a velocity that no engineering calculation had accounted for. Because no engineering calculation had ever modeled this exact geometry of partial intercept at this exact angle. The fragment was the size of a man's fist. It traveled at 4 times the speed of sound. And when it struck the antenna housing, it did not just destroy the antenna. It drove a conductive spike directly into the ship's aft electrical distribution bus through a path that the designers of that bus, working in a shipyard in Newport News, Virginia 3 decades earlier, had never considered a threat vector. The resulting electrical transient was catastrophic in scale and instantaneous in effect. At 3:51 a.m., the USS Harrowing Truman lost primary electrical power to 62% of her combat systems. The Combat Information Center went dark. Not dim, not reduced. Dark for 4.5 seconds. The most powerful naval command center in the world operated entirely on the ambient glow of a single emergency battery lamp bolted above the damage control panel. In those 4.5 seconds, every radar trace disappeared. Every missile track vanished. Every communication circuit went silent. The SPY-1D phased array radar, the cornerstone of the Aegis weapon system, the technological architecture on which the entire strike group's air defense rested, was offline. The Truman was blind. Emergency lighting kicked in on the backup circuit at 3:51:05 a.m., casting the CIC in the flat, merciless red of combat red lighting. The smell hit immediately. Not smoke, not yet, but ozone. The sharp chemical bite of electricity that has gone somewhere it was never supposed to go. The tactical action officer grabbed the 1MC handset on instinct and found it dead in his hand. He reached for the backup sound-powered telephone and called the engineering control station in the same breath. The voice that answered was already moving, deep inside the ship. 4 decks below the waterline, in the auxiliary machinery room that smelled permanently of hydraulic fluid and heated metal. The engineering officer of the watch had felt the transient before the lights went out. The deck plates had transmitted something wrong through the soles of his boots. Not a vibration he recognized, but an absence of one. The turbine generators that provided the ship's electrical backbone had not failed from lack of fuel or mechanical fatigue. They had tripped. The protection relays, systems designed to prevent catastrophic damage to the ship's electrical infrastructure by isolating faults, had done exactly what they were designed to do. They had seen an abnormal surge propagating through the aft bus, and they had opened the breakers. All of them, simultaneously. The ship was safe from the transient. But the ship was also blind, deaf, and drifting at 12 knots with approximately 9 minutes of remaining battery reserve on the Aegis combat system's emergency backup power. A system designed to allow a controlled, graceful shutdown, not to sustain active combat operations. At 3:52 a.m., the damage control assistant reached the DC Central Station at a dead run. He had been asleep in his rack 26 seconds earlier. The leather of his boots was not yet laced. His hands were steady. In the DC Central space, a room not much larger than a walk-in closet crammed with status boards, hydraulic manifolds, sound-powered telephone trunks, and the accumulated paper laminate of every emergency procedure the U.S. Navy had ever developed for a carrier of this class. He took exactly 2 seconds to assess the board. The aft electrical bus was isolated. The plant was in a tripped configuration. The path back to power ran through a manual restart sequence for the ship service turbine generators. A procedure that, under normal circumstances, took 22 minutes and required coordination between 4 separate machinery spaces. They had 9 minutes. He made the call to split the sequence. Instead of the standard serial restart procedure, one generator, then the next, with verification steps between each. He divided his damage control team into simultaneous parties, each assigned to a specific generator and a specific set of manual overrides. It was not in the written procedure. It was not a sanctioned deviation. It was the product of 11 years of standing watch in machinery spaces, of knowing the equipment not as a diagram on a laminated card, but as a physical object with behaviors and tolerances and particular ways of failing that no manual fully captured. He picked up the sound-powered telephone handset and gave his teams their assignments in the flat, precise voice of a man who has already done the calculation and accepted the risk. In the number 2 generator room, 2 machinists' mates worked by the light of battle lanterns, the beams cutting through air that had already thickened with the acrid residue of burned insulation from the damaged bus section 3 compartments forward. The heat in the space was physical. Not uncomfortable, not yet, but present, a weight pressing against exposed skin. One technician worked the manual governor linkage with both hands, his knuckles white against the steel handle, while the other read startup parameters from a laminated card held against the lantern beam. The card was wet with sweat from the hand that held it. The generator itself, a massive precision machine turbine the size of a small car, sat unresponsive, its normal hum replaced by the silence of a system that had been abruptly and violently interrupted. The first manual start attempt failed. The fuel control valve did not seat correctly on the initial cycle, a known idiosyncrasy of this particular unit that was documented in a maintenance note, not in the operating procedure. The technician knew it. He had written the maintenance note himself 2 deployments ago. He cycled the valve manually 3 times in rapid succession, purging the line of vapor lock, and attempted the restart sequence again. Above them, 4 decks up and 300 meters forward, the Aegis combat system's emergency battery reserve dropped through 60%. In the machinery control room, the engineering officer of the watch was on the sound-powered phone with DC Central, relaying status in both directions, managing the information flow between teams that could not see each other and could not use the ship's normal communication systems. He was doing this while simultaneously monitoring the plant status board, which was running on its own independent battery, and showed him, in stark analog terms, exactly how close the ship was to a condition from which recovery would not be a matter of procedure but of salvage. At 3:54 a.m., a new track appeared on the emergency tactical display in the CIC, not from the Truman's own radar. That was still dark. From one of the escort destroyers, transmitting targeting data over a backup data link that ran on a separate power circuit. The track was inbound. It was not a drone. The radar cross-section was too small for a ballistic missile. The speed profile matched a subsonic anti-ship cruise missile, the kind that flies at wave-top altitude below the radar horizon, designed specifically to exploit the gap in air defense coverage that occurs when a carrier's own Spy 1D array is offline. Someone on the other side had known the Truman was blind. They had pre-positioned a second strike package to exploit exactly this window. The cruise missile, or missiles, because the escort destroyer's data feed now showed 3 tracks, flying in a staggered formation at 15 meters above the wave surface, had been launched from a position off the Yemeni coast within 90 seconds of the Truman's power loss. This was not opportunistic. This was coordinated. The fragment that had struck the antenna housing had not been an accident of physics. It had been the trigger. The tactical action officer in the Truman's darkened CIC received the track data and made his first active decision since the blackout. He ordered the escort destroyers to engage the cruise missile tracks with their own SM-2 batteries, without waiting for confirmation from the carrier. He did not have the authority to commit another ship's magazine without the carrier's tactical concurrence. He made the call anyway. The geometry of the engagement did not leave room for the proper communication sequence. The first SM-2 launch from the escort screen lit the dark water with a flat, white reflection. The second followed before the first had cleared the launch rail. The CIC crew in the Truman could not see the launches. They could only see the data coming in over the backup link, but they felt the vibration in the deck as the destroyer 2,000 meters to port committed her interceptors against tracks that were now 9 minutes out and closing. The battery reserve on the Aegis system dropped through 30%. In the number 2 generator room, the manual start sequence completed on its second attempt. The turbine caught, not with the smooth, controlled acceleration of a normal start, but with a lurch and a surge that made the deck plates shudder, and the overhead lighting flicker on for 3 seconds before tripping again. Not enough. The generator was spinning but not stable, not synced to the ship's bus, producing power that could not yet be safely connected to the combat systems. The technician did not wait for stability. He manually overrode the synchronization interlock, a safety device designed to prevent an unsynchronized generator from being connected to an energized bus, and manually paralleled the generator to the emergency bus. This was the kind of decision that gets a sailor written up in peacetime. The risk of getting the phase angle wrong was an electrical transient that could damage equipment across the entire ship. He had been on watch in this space for 11 years. He knew the sound of this machine. He waited 2 seconds for the sound to tell him what the instruments couldn't confirm in time, and then he closed the breaker. The lights came on, not gradually, not in sequence. All of them simultaneously, as the Aegis combat system's emergency software completed its power restoration handshake and began a compressed startup sequence that would have taken 4 minutes under normal conditions. The engineering team on the software side had spent 3 weeks on a previous deployment pre-programming a rapid restart mode specifically for combat power loss scenarios. 3 weeks of unauthorized overtime in a server room in Norfolk, Virginia, that resulted in a patch that had never been officially certified for operational use. The patch was running now, at 3:58 a.m., 7 minutes and 11 seconds after the primary power loss. The SPY-1D phased array radar completed its initialization sequence and began transmitting. The tracks appeared immediately. All 3 cruise missiles, now 4 minutes and 40 seconds from the hull, had successfully evaded one of the 2 SM-2 intercepts from the escort screen. One had been neutralized at range. One had experienced guidance disruption from the intercept detonation and was tracking erratically. The third was flying straight, low, and fast, with a targeting solution locked on the carrier's flight deck. The range was 9 nautical miles. The failing CIWS, the close-in weapon system mounted on the carrier's sponsons, had been running on its own independent power supply throughout the blackout. It had been tracking. It had been waiting. But its engagement authority had been locked out by the combat system's offline status. The lock released the moment Aegis came back online. The CIWS engaged at a range of 4 nautical miles. The 20mm rotary cannon began firing at a rate that produced a sound less like individual rounds and more like fabric tearing. A continuous mechanical shriek that cut across the pre-dawn water and lit the sea surface with ejected brass. The missile ate through the first burst and kept coming. The CIWS tracked and corrected. Second burst. The missile detonated 700 meters from the hull, close enough that the crew on the flight deck watch felt the pressure wave against their chest plates and saw the fireball reflected in the sea surface below them. 700 meters. In any combat evaluation, that was a success. Standing on the deck with the concussion still ringing in your ears, it felt like something else entirely. But the engagement was not over. At 4:01 a.m., the escort destroyer's passive sonar reported a transient. Not surface. Subsonic. 60 meters below the waterline and accelerating toward the outer screen. The Houthi surface attack had been the distraction. The asset that had been waiting position during the preceding days while the strike group was focused on the aerial threat envelope was a submarine. Not Iranian Navy, not in the conventional sense, but an asset operated by proxy crews trained by Iranian naval instructors running Iranian-supplied hardware on a mission profile designed in Tehran and executed from a position that U.S. Naval's intelligence had assessed as low probability. The assessment had been wrong. The P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft assigned to the strike group was already airborne, operating a barrier patrol 40 miles to the south. It received the contact report and began its run. The submarine, having committed to its attack profile, had sacrificed its acoustic stealth to achieve targeting geometry. It was fast now, shallow and loud, audible on every sensor in the defensive screen. The escort destroyer's own torpedoes were in the water before the submarine completed its firing solution. The engagement was over in 104 seconds. The USS Harrowing. Truman and her crew spent the next 6 hours in damage assessment, system verification, and the slow, grinding work of accounting for every piece of equipment that had been online when the power failed and every system that had come back in a state different from the one it left. The Aegis combat system required 3 separate software revalidation sequences before the fleet commander would certify it operationally ready. The aft electrical bus required full replacement of 14 damaged distribution panels. The antenna array on the island superstructure was rebuilt from spares carried in the forward supply stowage. A job that normally takes a shipyard crew in 3 days, accomplished by the Truman's own electronics technicians in 11 hours. The flight deck resumed operations at 2:15 p.m. Here now are the numbers, stripped of context, standing alone the way numbers do when a story is over. 18 total inbound threats across the engagement window. 3 separate strike packages employed by the adversary. 7 minutes and 11 seconds of total Aegis blackout. 62% of combat systems offline at peak degradation. 9 minutes of emergency battery reserve consumed to the last moment. 1 forward deployed damage control team split across 3 simultaneous generator restart sequences. 0 major hull damage. 700 meters, the closest the adversary came to the flight deck. 5 sailors treated for minor injuries from the concussion wave. 11 personnel in the engineering team that brought the ship back to life. The adversary had studied the Truman for weeks. They had identified a fragile node in the electrical architecture. They had pre-positioned assets to exploit the vulnerability window. They had executed a coordinated multi-domain attack with a level of operational sophistication that no prior Houthi engagement had demonstrated. They had come closer than any public briefing would ever officially acknowledge. And they had still failed. Not because of a system, not because of a satellite or an algorithm or a procurement contract signed in a committee room in Washington. Because 11 men and women in a hot, dark, ozone-smelling machinery space 1,100 miles from the nearest dry dock had refused to accept the math that said their ship was finished. They had bent a procedure they knew better than the people who wrote it, trusted their hands over their instruments, and given the machine back its voice with seconds remaining. The technology on that ship is extraordinary, but it is only as extraordinary as the people who keep it alive when it is trying to stop. A warship does not survive because its systems are invincible. It survives because its crew has already decided long before the crisis arrives that they will not be the ones who let it sink. The Red Sea holds its silence, but it knows which ships earned the right to pass.